Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Innovative Solutions to End Food Insecurity. And before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's virtual event. You've joined the presentation listening through your computer's speaker system by default, and throughout the presentation, you can submit your questions by typing them into the questions section. So just look for a question icon, click on that, and then we'll be addressing those questions during the Q&A portion at the end. The speaker bios of our presenters today have been provided and can be accessed through the handout section. So just look for a little handout icon, click on that, and then to access it, you'll click on it to open. It'll open in a new window, and from there you can save or print it out. I would now like to introduce your host, Pamela Norley, President of Fidelity Charitable. Welcome, Pam.
Thank you so much, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. We're really excited to have this opportunity to provide an update on the basic need of hunger. So as the U.S. went into shutdown last March, large numbers of working Americans suffered real financial hardship. Food banks saw a 55% increase in people needing their services. We all remember the media clips of the long lines of cars lined up to get groceries in their trunks. And without volunteers and with the early challenges in managing the supply chain, many organizations that focused on helping with food were in real crisis. And while Americans responded with both financial and food donations, and in fact at Fidelity Charitable, donations to address food insecurity was up 12-fold. We now have 42 million Americans, including 13 million children, who are food insecure. So hunger has become the largest issue facing this country since the pandemic. Food insecurity, as we all know, was a big issue before the pandemic, but we were actually making some progress. But COVID has turned that all around. The 42 million compares with the 35 million that were food insecure at the end of 2019. So we really have some work to do to get after that. What we want to do is both address the need for immediate short-term solutions, but as well as taking a look at the importance of building long-term systemic solutions to try to address the issues of both hunger and poverty. So for today's session, I'm really excited to introduce you to the three experts that we have in the field that are going to share some of their latest insights and solutions to address this problem of food insecurity, both in the short and the long term. We've convened three high-profile leaders for some of the largest food-focused charities in the country, and they all have complementary areas of attention. First, we have Claire Batteneau-Fontenot, the head of Feeding America. Second, Nate Mook, who's the CEO of World Central Kitchen. And then third, Billy Shore, who founded and leads the campaign No Kid Hungry through Share Your Strength. So again, as mentioned, these are incredibly, remarkably inspiring people, and we've got their bios below, and they have lots of material on their organizations that they hope you'll dig into. So we have three simple objectives for our time together today. One, I want to provide an update on the current state of Americans at risk for hunger. Two, we want to inform you about some of the new opportunities to strengthen the food economy and systems. And some of this came out of the innovation of having to address the urgent need that we had with the pandemic. And third, we also want to let you know how you and your families listening to these panelists can support these innovations to fight hunger. And then again, as we mentioned, we'll have an opportunity for questions at the end, because certainly there's a lot of things that came out in advance that we hope that we get to, but if we don't, we'll have a time for Q&A. So with that, let me dig in, and let me start first with you, Claire. If you would give us a little bit of the state of the state, what is that 35 million made up of in terms of our neighbors?
Wow. So actually, I have to start by saying thank you to you, Pam, and to the team at Fidelity, and to so many of the people who are tuning in are people who are already engaged, some long-term, some mid, and some short-term in the work that we're doing. So thank you so much to all of you. And I am honored that I have the opportunity to be a part of this august panel. There are a lot of people who are struggling, who had been struggling for a long time, and that number has only grown during the pandemic. As you mentioned, the 35 actually reflects food insecurity rates in 2019. Unfortunately, we've seen those numbers soar. Our estimate is that 42 million people will be food insecure as a result of this pandemic this year, that about 13 million of whom will be kids. And then to break it down a little farther, you also referenced that we saw a 55% increase in need in our network. That is what the constant need is, including today. earlier on in the pandemic, we had members who saw as much as a 400% increase in demand. We've also, one of the nuances of this that might not be clear to the audience is how many people who are turning to us for help never before relied upon the charitable food system. That number has been around 40% from the beginning, and it still is to this day. People who didn't imagine that in order to feed their families, they would have to get in that long line and get access to food in that way. What we knew was that there are a lot of vulnerable communities in this country already comprised inside of that 35 million. We knew that there were others who were right at the precipice, barely holding on. So many people in the country live paycheck to paycheck. So that with the assault of this crisis came along with it, some of them have just deepened their level of food insecurity. Others have joined that unfortunate rank. We also know what the data says about the fact that this is likely to be a marathon and not a sprint. As of the last economic downturn in 2008, it took 10 years to return to pre-recession rates of food insecurity. 10 years. 10 years to get to 37 million in 2018. We know how to make progress. We made progress, but surely everyone in this audience would agree to two fundamental things. One, 10 years is too long. And two, 35 million is 35 million too many. So I'm excited to have a chance to dig even more deeply on these really important issues. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you. So Billy and Nate, anything to add to the state of the state right now on food and hunger?
Well, I guess I would just address one subset of what Claire talked about. And first, of course, add my word of thanks to Fidelity Charitable. It's such an important conversation at this particular moment. And I can't think of anyone better to have it with than Claire and Nate from World Central Kitchen. The subset we focused on at Share Our Strength and the No Kid Hungry campaign have been children. And when you think about the numbers that Claire described, the subset I'll give you is 22 million kids in this country are eligible for a free or reduced price school lunch, which gives you a sense of their ongoing need. This is before the pandemic. And 22 million kids need lunch, they need breakfast, they need summer meals, and they depended on the school system to get those meals, and then the schools closed, almost all of them. So that became a population that was especially vulnerable, and we can talk more about it as we go, but I just wanted to flag, in addition to the massive need that Claire described, we've got the children who are the most vulnerable, the least responsible for the situation that they find themselves in.
How fast will, because that was, I think, the thing that really we all acknowledged right away, is that a lot of children were getting food at school, and both breakfast and lunch, and food taken home on the weekends. Just to jump into some of the innovative things that were being done during the pandemic. How did you switch to address getting food to children and their families who had been dependent on it before the pandemic through their schools?
Well, we really had to do two things. One is we had to create the flexibilities to feed kids in different ways, because the laws had been very, very strict for a long time about what it takes to get a meal reimbursed if you're going to feed it to a child. The child had to be at school. The child had to get the meal themselves. So Congress, in the very first days of the pandemic, passed legislation that created flexibilities and waivers so that you could provide food to the parents, you could provide food out of school, you could deliver it to homes, you could not deliver just one meal, but you could deliver multiple meals. Those all became very important, and I think there'll be a long-term impact to that. But the second thing we had to do is, once we had the flexibility, of course, as a community, and I think I can probably speak for Claire and Nate and many other colleagues we worked with on the ground, we had to make sure that the schools had the capacity to feed kids in a different way, not just the flexibility, but the capacities. So they needed personal protective equipment, they needed storage, they needed transportation, they needed staffing, they did grab and go meals outside of schools. They had buses, instead of picking kids up on the corner, dropping the meals off where they used to pick the kids up. So there were a lot of different ways. Share Our Strength distributed about $70 million in grants to schools and community organizations over the last 5 months, just aimed at making sure they could feed kids in alternative ways that the pandemic required.
Yeah. So Nate, I knew that you were involved in the FEED Act and helping kind of get that through. I mean, I know probably all of you were involved in that in some way. Can you talk about, how we were able to, within 2 weeks, really almost, of shutting down, have legislation passed that would address kind of the flexibility and the need that we saw?
Yeah, I think, as Billy said, we really, this crisis that we saw unfolding last year really was unprecedented, right? I mean, it was across in our big cities and small towns, and really required new approaches. This is not something that we've had to face as a country before, and we had to move very quickly to come up with innovative solutions. World Central Kitchen, as a nonprofit that typically focuses on disaster response, emergency response, tends to do so in a very, we can do so in a sort of a narrow geographical area, after a hurricane or a wildfire in California. But this was a disaster that was affecting everyone everywhere, and it really required new approaches. And as Billy mentioned, around the schools had to innovate and come up with new ways to get food out to families and kids that could not come to the schools, using things like school buses. And from World Central Kitchen's perspective, we looked at how could we activate kitchens that already exist in local communities across the country. And so we were able to build a network of over 3,000 restaurants across the country, putting folks back to work in the process who were ultimately out of work because of the pandemic, preparing meals for their local communities. And this was sort of, using the philanthropic dollars as a catalyst, really pushing for the federal government to also embrace this model. And which we thought, was made a lot of sense. You could keep people working, you could keep the supply chains going for food, and also prepare fresh, healthy meals out to families and seniors that were isolated, especially in the early days of the pandemic. So we were able to get legislation out front and center that really sort of helped lay some of the foundation and the groundwork for policies that could lead to large programs, government-funded programs, such as the Great Plates program in California, and feeding programs in places like New Orleans and others that were able to tap into these restaurants. Because I think, as Claire mentioned to start the conversation, the scale of what we were facing is so large that the social fabric that was in existence, the food banks that were there, they couldn't carry the weight by themselves, right? We had to all come together, all these different players, to really play a role in helping make sure that our families could have food. And now, as we look to the future, we still have quite a bit of work to do, because of course we're not through this yet.
No. And so you think about collaboration being such an important component of this. You're feeding after disasters. Obviously, you've got to run all the food banks around the country. You're focused on children. What were the criteria that were used to determine who were the best partners to work with? What were the, was there a systems approach to how you thought about, like, just starting with you, Nate, in terms of the 3,000 restaurants that you identified? I mean, how it just feels a little bit overwhelming in terms of where you go and how you bring everybody together. I assume you're using social media and technology to bring attention to some of these issues and opportunities.
Absolutely. I mean, I think exactly as you said, I mean, it really was collaboration, right? So we were bringing together the private sector through businesses like restaurants and food suppliers. Also, the philanthropic dollars that were coming from the corporate sector, which were really crucial to getting these programs off the ground. But really, the partnerships are really where the magic happens. So we worked closely with school districts across the country. So for example, in Oakland, with the Oakland Unified School District, we were able to serve meals from restaurants on top of what the kids were receiving. So then when the parents and the kids were coming to get meals, they could also take these restaurant meals back home. We launched a program in Los Angeles with the LA Unified School District, where again, we had extra meals for families. We were distributing about 50,000 meals a day that could go to parents, that could go to other members of the households, because the kids were the ones that were eligible to receive the school meals. We work closely with nonprofits and community-based organizations on the ground to really identify where the strongest needs were. So looking at how this crisis went from a a public health crisis to an economic crisis to then a humanitarian crisis, and where were those greatest humanitarian needs? So absolutely, social media, engaging with local community organizations, working with restaurants, the folks on the ground in communities know best, right? So for us, it was really about engaging and uplifting those groups that were already there on the ground, and how we could come in and be supportive of a lot of those efforts.
Yeah, so that's so Claire, let me go back to you, and just in talking about, we're all well aware of that, the pandemic had a disproportionate impact on people of color. And, I saw some stats maybe from your research around, Black and Hispanic families are almost twice as likely to suffer from food insecurity as white families. And so how did you address those particularly vulnerable people at the same time that there was a demand from almost everyone and constituents that you hadn't served in the past?
Yeah, Pamela, if you allow me to step back one hair, just to make certain that the audience really does understand what the Feeding America Network is. So we have a national office in which I have the privilege to serve, 200 member food banks that stretch out across the United States and Puerto Rico, and 60,000 agency partners and meal programs. So to try to wrap your head around the scale of what was done last year, we provided 6.1 billion meals, 6.1 billion meals to people facing hunger. And I love the people that I'm on this panel with, because it just continues to help us to understand the scale of the need, that all of us were engaged in these Herculean efforts. And there still are people who are struggling that we did not touch, even with 6.1 billion meals, plus the meals that have been generated through these other avenues. There were things that were hidden in plain sight before the pandemic that the light shines brightly on today. For instance, communities of color and what's happening with communities of color when it comes to food insecurity. As you said, the range is from 1.75 to nearly 3 times, depending upon which community you speak of. And along with that, those challenges around food insecurity come other statistics, like people who are food insecure are about 3 times more likely to suffer from diabetes and to suffer from hypertension. So what winds up happening? You've got a health crisis on top of a food crisis, on top of a humanitarian crisis, as Nate just astutely mentioned. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw communities of color hospitalized at 4 times the rate of whites and die at 5 times, up to 5 times the rate as whites. So it is really important for our whole society to really think carefully and meaningfully about how to address the very question that you speak of. And my approach and our approach at Feeding America is to recognize that what we've been doing before, we've got to rewrite the playbook. Okay, I don't want to return to normal for 35 million people who are facing food insecurity. We can do better. We're confident that we will do better, and that a significant piece of that doing better is in addressing some of those systemic issues. And rather than take a narrow top-down approach, to take a broader bottom-up approach. And that's exactly what we're working to do. And we went out to communities that we knew, because we've had this infrastructure in place for a very long time, and each of our members are inside of communities. So we were able to activate inside of the communities that had the greatest needs. And when we knew that, you talk about the lines of cars, and I'm sure cognitively people think, well, wait a minute, some people are so challenged, they don't even have a car.
Right.
How are you getting to the people who don't have a car? Well, we found active ways to go out into communities with local distributions inside of rural communities, inside of urban communities. Those same bus routes that Billy was talking about, we tracked with bus routes as well, providing meals to children. We acknowledge that food insecure kids live inside of food insecure households. And I'm so proud of the work that we've all done as a community to address that. And Billy and the team at Share Our Strength have been absolutely critical in addressing that reality and expanding how it is that we look at children's food insecurity. So that's some of what we're doing now. And again, there's a lot of work left to do, but I think we should at least pause for a second and reflect on the fact that because of that remarkable generosity, because we were actually even able to get Congress to agree on something, which is that they should invest in this, we've gotten a lot done, but there's a lot left to do.
Yeah, no, for sure. And Billy, I want to turn to you, and maybe like, again, we're talking about some innovative ways. We're talking about, addressing buses to bring food to the children as opposed to them going to school to get it. We've talked about bringing together restaurants to serve communities. What other innovative models have you seen that kind of, or not erupted, but just evolved during the pandemic and the crisis that we think will accelerate transformation on this issue?
Well, I think what's going to change this issue, and I think there's a paradox here, because in some ways we've gone back almost 10 years. And again, if I look at it through the lens of kids, childhood hunger, we're probably where we were 10 years ago. We lost about 10 years of progress. But on the other hand, I'm actually convinced that this issue is more solvable going forward than it's ever been before, for some of the reasons that we've discussed here. There's much greater awareness of the impact of hunger, and there's much greater awareness of what Claire was saying, that there are systemic issues behind it. Everybody's in favor of feeding a hungry child. Not everybody has been in favor of doing what I'd say some of us agree is the most important thing you can do for a hungry child, is strengthen their families, make sure that their parents or caregivers have what they need, that they have the economic resources to be able to provide for themselves. So I think there have been, innovations around issues like, how we get meals to kids and how they get delivered to their homes and things like that. I think many of the things that we fought for early on were actually the kind of flexibilities and the waivers were things we fought for 10 or 15 years. Like when we try and feed kids meals in the summertime, it's very hard to do because you have to bring the kids to the meal. You can't take the meals to the kids, as backwards as that may sound. But many of these flexibilities and waivers are going to stay in place, I believe. I think this administration and Congress have seen, and that this community has proven, that there's an efficiency and an effectiveness to getting meals to kids in these different ways. The big opportunity is going to be if we get to some of these systemic issues. So, just for example, the biggest innovation, and you wouldn't think of it as a feeding innovation, but the child tax credit that's part of the American Rescue Plan is expected to lift 40% of kids out of poverty and 1.1 million kids out of deep poverty, which is kids who live at half the poverty line, kids who live in families at half the poverty line. That's just enormous. That was unimaginable any time in the past. It was unimaginable 6 weeks ago. It was unimaginable under President Obama's administration. It was just not in the cards, and now it's the law of the land. The important thing for all of us on this call and everybody in this audience is that passing a law is only half the battle. The other half is making sure that its benefits reach everybody who are eligible for it, and that's something that we're going to all have to commit ourselves to.
No, I'm glad you bring that up. I know that the president has put in place, I think it's Gene Sperling who's working on kind of implementation. It's like, we have a lot of non-filers out there. So although you don't have this great benefit that's available, we have to figure out how we can get people to be able to access it. It's really significant funding. So is there any other ideas out there that you think will sustain? I mean, I guess there's no expiration on the flexibility provisions that were included in the FEED Act. Does it expire at a certain time? Are we only eligible for that flexibility from government during a pandemic?
Well, I think there's a couple of different areas. I think the waivers that Billy's talking about for schools and school feeding programs unfortunately will expire at some point, so we have to keep pushing for that. The FEED Act specifically around FEMA reimbursement for cities and states to feed their residents will expire at the end of September. So there is a time frame on that related to the disaster declaration. So these things certainly won't go on forever, but I do think they, the models that have been created and to show the power when you put these policies into place and how they benefit not only the families, but just our entire country at large, right? All of these knock-on effects that can happen. So I think, we can keep fighting and keep pushing for some of these changes to continue on. And that's really what's going to have to be done. I think as I look sort of into the future and sort of some of the work that's been done, if there is a silver lining of sorts through this pandemic, it's that I think it's been a bit of a wake-up call for our country around the importance of our food system and how fragile it is, right? And how quickly it can start to break down, and then everything else that sort of domino effects from that. And if we do not have the underpinnings of a strong, healthy food ecosystem, then we all suffer as a nation. I think, certainly we can go as far as saying that food should be a human right, that we should not be, food should be something that families do not have to struggle for to get through the day. And we have a lot of work to make that happen, but I do think there is great awareness and great work that has been done by so many organizations. And so I do think some of these innovations will be able to live on. And as Claire said, we're not just going to sort of flip right back to the status quo. I think we really do kind of have to keep pushing forward.
Yeah, we'll get to
Pamela, outside of the policy interventions, which the good news is, there are many things I don't have to say because I agree exactly with Billy and Nate. Let me talk about a few of the innovations that have happened inside of our network as we're looking at the on the ground innovations. So things like one of them has been around something that might sound ostensibly as simple, but to get refrigerated boxes with food inside of them out into rural communities and have a digital code that someone can access that locker, where it's similar to what you think about an Amazon local, you can go to locally, but you can do it on your own time. So if the hour is not the same as the mobile distribution, you can go and get access. Another space that I'm really excited and energized around is we had something already in place called an e-pantry.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stigma attached. There is a concept in this country, and Billy alluded to it a bit before. The one thing that we can all collectively agree is that a 2-year-old should not be responsible for finding his or her own food. Right. But beyond that, we don't agree on a lot of it. So there's a concept of earned hunger in this country. Earned hunger. You don't need to help them because they're in that position because of themselves. If they just tried harder, they get out of it, when the vast majority of people in need of food are either children, elderly, people with disabilities, or working class, poor people. So that's simply not true, right? And part of my responsibility, our collective responsibility, is to use opportunities like this to help people to understand whom it is that really does face hunger in the country, and so that we can all be collectively engaged in coming up with solutions. But there is that stigma, and we know the stigma exists. So there are people who are entitled to certain benefits who don't access them. Feeding America, outside of the government, #1 in connecting people to federal nutrition programs, right? But we can do more, and we will do more. And we're also looking at e-pantries where people get the dignity of choice, but from their homes. And then they get access to the food. So there's shame in being in the line. Right. So those are the kinds of innovations that we're going to take with us, and we need partners to help get that last mile piece of it figured out. But I'm really optimistic about where some of this is heading.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear you share that. I know preparing for this conversation, I spoke with, I know you probably know Catherine D'Amato, who is the trustee on the Fidelity Charitable Board. And I was involved with the food bank for a period of time when I was in Boston, and she said that this is going to be returning dignity. Instacart, where people can actually select the food they want and then go to a place. Wonderful if it's on their own time. They don't have to, meet some requirement that requires them to be away from work in order to get food. So that's wonderful to see that the flexibility has been built in that, and there's different models that are evolving that hopefully will sustain, that provide people a level of dignity as they approach.
I'm really
food.
proud that we're not alone in this, but oh my, we've got people like Catherine who have been stalwarts in this for decades, who have been working not only at the really awesome responsibility of feeding the line, but also looking at the systemic issues that we need to address in order to shorten it. So yeah, absolutely, yes.
So Billy, let me turn to you. You know, we talked about really the importance of collaboration, and I think, you know, there's nothing like a good crisis to bring everybody together and all be aligned in terms of the mission, and this one is food. But, you know, are there any examples where No Kid Hungry and Share the Strength have worked collaboratively since, you know, kind of since we've got the vaccine, you know, more recently, that you think will sustain long term?
Yeah, well, I think in a way, probably all of us have, and you know, one of the reasons you probably have the three of us on this call is we've all had relationships for quite a while now. In terms of, you know, to your earlier question about how do you know who the groups are that you would invest in and that you would collaborate with. Certainly, the pandemic accelerated the need to do more of that. So, you know, all three of us are on a weekly call, or our representatives are, with a number of other anti-hunger organizations that talk very specifically about where food shortages are now, what advocacy opportunities exist now. I'm going to say, Nate, maybe we have like 15 organizations on that call that we've been doing every Friday with the Emerson Collective. This is with Lorraine Powell Jobs and Arnie Duncan. So there's a lot of things like that at the macro level. And then I think a lot of us individually, as Nate was saying earlier, you know, many of these solutions are community driven. And so, you know, we think in terms of always trying to build what we call a kind of a collaborative table, and to bring the local experts in the room, around the table, or on a Zoom call to say, what is it that you need? One of the things we found is that you can inspire collaboration, but you have to purchase execution. Many of these organizations are stretched very thin, and they need resources. And so, you know, that's as kind of national leaders, I think the three of us have to find ways to actually resource local and community-driven and regional organizations as well.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good thing. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Pamela, I was going to just add to that, and I know that it's something that Billy's and his organization are working on as well. I think it goes even one step, maybe even lower, if you will, more granular. People with lived and living experience need to be at that table. I think part of the reason that we continue to struggle with these big issues is that we're not asking the right people. So we don't have a dearth of innovation and ingenuity among vulnerable communities. They're some of the most innovative communities there are. They've had to withstand all manner of assaults. And we must do a better job of inviting them to tables that are decision-making tables and asking them about effective solutions for their own communities. That's certainly true with communities of color. Feeding America does not have to establish its own credibility with inside of communities of color. We have to make certain that we partner with organizations that have hundreds of years of service inside of those communities. And so part of it for us at the national level, I believe, is giving some of the power away.
Yeah.
Some of it is sharing some of the power as well. And I think that's where those answers are going to be unlocked. I really do.
Claire, you were mentioning a moment ago connecting people to federal nutrition assistance programs, and I would say all of us are engaged with organizations. To give you a couple examples, Benefits Data Trust, M-Relief, other organizations that are working now, and this is such an important collaboration. If you're on getting school meals, is your family enrolled in SNAP? If you're getting Medicaid, are you enrolled in SNAP and or WIC and other benefits? So this kind of cross collaboration, so that we can ultimately create a kind of a one-stop shopping, so that you get the entire suite of benefits that you need, because one benefit alone is not going to solve your family's problem, most likely. That's a whole new level of collaboration that I think is starting to take place.
Agreed, Billy.
And are you excited about it sustaining? I mean, are you optimistic it'll sustain? I mean, were those calls that you're talking about on Fridays, were they happening before the crisis?
No.
Okay.
No.
There's sense, and I'll speak for myself. These gentlemen can speak for themselves quite well, but I'm really optimistic that they're going to sustain, because the people who do this work, Billy and Nate, they do it because they care about people facing hunger. Right? They're not going to stop caring about people facing hunger when the lights go away, when the cameras go away. They're going to still care. So I think what we've had are these wonderful on-ramps to collaboration that we didn't have, or maybe we didn't create in the same way, but I can't imagine us stepping away from. I know Feeding America is going to definitely continue to be energized at those types of collaborative teams.
Yeah, so we're now, I want to now turn to kind of how our donors and their families can get involved in addressing some of these issues, both in the short term and the long term. I think we've talked about collaboration, we've talked about advocacy. To know that the FEED Act is going to expire in September, that requires more voice probably to being brought to our Congress people to let them know that this is something that we need to make sure sustains to address the continuing need to get at the 42 million. What are some other things? I know we don't normally talk about like infrastructure when we talk about charities. Are there infrastructure changes that need to happen that we think we could come together to support? Is there anything out there? When I say infrastructure, I mean just kind of basic fundamental, leadership training, how to onboard volunteers, how to think about diversity and inclusion. Are there any things like that you think have come out of the pandemic, any kind of infrastructure focus? I know at Fidelity Charitable, for example, we were very successful in getting our donors to move from, I want my money to go here, to we trust the charity to make the decision as to how to allocate the funds. So a lot of our, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but a lot of our funding for 2020, and we gave away $9.1 billion to 170,000 charities on behalf of our donors. Large one of them being Feeding America made our top 20 for the list for the first time. Very proud of that. But people just are saying, we're just gonna, you tell us what to do. So I hope you're seeing that it's continued to have the nonprofit make decisions about where the money and the funding should be given, even if it is to support salary and hiring of people to support the mission.
Absolutely. I can start by saying yes, yes, infrastructure, that kind of infrastructure is absolutely needed. That kind of discretion is, and empowerment is critically needed. I won't speak more on that. I will say this, that there's other kind of infrastructure that's needed too. So there's a need, we all have an aspiration around more nutritious food being provided to communities. Well, there are communities that don't have access to refrigeration. Right. So you can't give the community fresh produce and then it's going to rot in the community because they don't have access to the refrigeration. So there are basic infrastructure in the conventional sense of the word, if you will, that's lacking in many places. It's a place where we're doubling down on investments in that space at Feeding America, and it's definitely an area that requires a lot of help.
Right. Well, and we've had to digitize everything, right? Go ahead, Nate. Sorry.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just going to say, yeah, I'll echo what Claire said. We worked extensively through this pandemic in Navajo Nation, which required a completely different approach to getting food out to families because of lack of refrigeration and the distance between households, and it just required new approaches. I think when we look at infrastructure, one of the things that World Central Kitchen looks at is some of the, how can we leverage, even though we're a nonprofit, how can we think more like a startup, right? How can we think more entrepreneurial? How can we leverage new technologies? How can we work with donors to come up with new ways and new approaches that can also leverage the private sector? And I think one of the things that we're really excited about is something going back to what Claire said before, which is really about putting agency back into the households, right? Back to the families, giving them the power to decide when they need food and to decide what food they need versus just, here's what you get and you got to go to this place and go pick it up and that's what you got. And I think there is a lot of opportunity moving forward where we can build systems and technology and connections and collaboration to improve that type of response. One of the things that we've built at World Central Kitchen is what we call Wck Direct. This is our direct to household delivery program. It's very simple. It's a text or phone call to order program where somebody can just take their phone and during a certain period of time of day, send a text and choose a meal from a restaurant, which then they can either go pick up at the restaurant or they can get it delivered through one of the third-party delivery services. So tapping into the private sector to do some of that door-to-door delivery as well. And what we really love about this is it really puts the power back to the households. They can get food. Maybe they're working during the day and they need help at dinner. Maybe they're taking care of their kids during the day and they're okay at dinner time. And so, you know, it gives them that power. And of course, it's not going to solve all of the hunger problems, but again, the idea is to kind of serve as a bit of a bridge, a supportive mechanism as folks get back up on their feet. And so that's just one example. I think there's so much really interesting work that can be done, and donors like Fidelity donors can play such a critical role because they are oftentimes the catalyzing agent, right? That donor, that philanthropic money enables you to test stuff out, right? To try out these new approaches that maybe a federal grant or other type of money wouldn't let you do. And so that sort of bit of flexibility and to be a catalyst for some of these new ideas is going to be such a critical way, I think, for donors and Fidelity donors to play a role moving forward.
Yeah, you know, I would just love a quick comment on our responsibility to the donors, because I think what you're hearing us say is we want the donors to invest in capacity because we believe capacity will translate directly into impact. But on the other hand, I think we have to be responsible to holding ourselves accountable to having that impact and to measuring that impact and communicating it. You've got two leaders here in Claire and Nate who are superb at that, but it's a responsibility for our sector because so many times donors don't know how to judge an organization. So they'll look at overhead or something. And I always think, you know, I always grab my iPhone. In the history of Apple, no one's ever walked into an Apple store and said, I think I want one of these, but what's the overhead out there in Cupertino, California? I need to know how much you pay your staff. They're buying it because it serves a very specific need. And I think it's incumbent on us in the nonprofit sector to be very clear about how we're serving the need, be very clear about the impact that we're having, and hold ourselves accountable to that, and then let donors judge. But don't make the conversation about overhead.
No, Bill, you know, Billy, so we have so many questions coming in, and I want to now maybe kind of turn to some of the audience questions. And actually, one of them was about any thoughts on how to best evaluate efficiency of new nonprofits. A lot of nonprofits, you know, we now have 1.7 million nonprofits in this country, and how should they be thinking about the impact of organizations that have just been established on addressing food insecurity? Like, what are some of the measures and metrics they should be looking and asking for?
I'm happy to jump in, or to whom are you directed? Okay, all right, so I'm happy to do it, and I think it starts by dovetailing what Billy was just talking about, so maybe he can double down on some of that as well. I think that I'm inspired by the fact that so many people have capacity in their hearts for service. I don't happen to believe that what our society needs more of is organizations serving people. I think what we need more of are organizations working together to serve people, and people working together to serve people. I want to say that from the beginning. But I think it's in support of what Billy was just saying, and a really important pivot in the life cycle of Feeding America has been on moving away from gauging input and moving toward gauging impact. So working with organizations who can help to both quantitatively and qualitatively help the donor to understand, when you invest in this is what you're investing in, and this is what you should reasonably expect to get. And I don't in any way want to be pejorative, as I said, I hope that's coming through, but a desire to serve is not the same as serving. A desire to serve is the underpinning, foundational to finding a pathway to being impactful and to serving. And I think that's where I would encourage. And I think some of this is, you can look at a 990, you can see how money gets used, you can see how much access people have to revenue, but get to know the places that you're going to be making the investments. Have confidence in the direction, the vision for the organization. They should be able to articulate what are they trying to do, and why do they have reason to believe that by doing what they're doing, they're going to get what they and that donor needs.
Right. And so Billy and Nate just would ask you to add on to that. I mean, and just in terms of being specific, obviously you talked about the 6.1 million meals that Feeding America got out, 6.1 billion meals that
Thank
America
you for that. Billion.
I don't want to miss that. But what are some other like specifics that our donors should be asking as they think about investing in this area with their philanthropy?
Yeah, well, I think in our case, when before the pandemic, when we were just focused on what we call the No Kid Hungry campaign, we had very specific metrics. We wanted to make sure that kids got 3 meals a day, and we were going to measure that by knowing whether all the kids who were eligible for getting school breakfast were actually getting it. That's something you can count, and you can go state by state. And I remember there was a point in Maryland where we said we had to add 64,000 kids to the school breakfast program in Maryland. And any given month, we could tell you, we've now added 14,000 of the 60,000 or 20,000. So I think Claire said it so well. The very simple, but it's such a difficult question to answer. It's a simple question. What does success look like for you? I think that's what donors should be asking organizations, and organizations have to articulate with precision and clarity, and they have to do the work up front to do that. So if for nobody else, so that they know whether they're getting their bang for their buck, whether they're getting the return on the investment. Most of the people who are working in the nonprofit community are, working flat out 24/7. And this pandemic has been like, running a marathon and a sprint simultaneously. So just for the people at the center of it, we need to know, are we having the most impact we can have, or should we make a shift? Should we make a tweak, an adjustment? But many of these things can be countered if you're willing to hold yourselves accountable and to understand that if you miss, you'll have to adjust.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn to a really unpleasant topic that I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And Nate, I'm going to ask you to respond to this question from one of our donors. So how are NPOs working to redirect the significant food waste present in the production side for those in need in the consumption side? So the data that I've read and the research I've read indicates that the US is the largest food waster on the planet. And that there's plenty of food to feed the 35 million that we've talked about, or the 42 million that we've talked about. Nate, how are we addressing food waste?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we could actually do a whole webinar, I think, on food waste and the food system itself. I think there's two ways of looking at food waste. One is sort of on the agriculture side, right? This is kind of what we saw in the news, and you saw farmers that were plowing under their crops because they had no one to sell them to. You had, dairies dumping their milk. We see stories about sort of imperfect produce, right? Your tomatoes that look a little weird, so they don't go onto the, so there's that sort of piece of sort of utilizing, food, good, healthy, good food right there. There's the other side that's sort of like the excess, sort of like the extra food. So like what's left at a restaurant at the end of the night and those types of things. And I think, food waste is a big challenge, because I do think it's important that we do not look at, it's not as simple as looking at the numbers and saying, oh, well, we can just take this and feed everybody else, right? And we also need to recognize that we need to think about equity as part of this as well, right? We can't sort of say, oh, we have, lower income families and lower income communities, let's just give them all of the trash food and then have them, figure out how to utilize it, right? That's also not a good approach. So I think it's gonna take a bit of, systemic work to really look at, what can we do on the agriculture side and how we move food across the country, right? And how can our logistics and understanding of the creation of the growing of food and where we may have excess and where we may have less, and get better at that. And I know that is something that the federal government is looking at, how can they subsidize some of this movement of food? I do think when you're looking at sort of the extra of in the creation of food, of what restaurants might have or stuff that would normally get thrown away, there are organizations that do great work with excess food. Folks, an organization here in Washington, D.C. called DC Central Kitchen that does food for local shelters and schools. with excess food. And there are these organizations that are utilizing it, but I do think we have to be careful. It's not going to solve the problem, right? It's not just because there's a percentage of extra, all of a sudden we can't just go and suddenly repurpose that and feed everybody. We do have to be realistic about it, but it's a great point, because there's a lot of innovation that's being done, and also more that could be done, especially on the agricultural side.
Right. I mean, even if
I feel I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that among the organizations that do food waste recovery would be the Feeding America Network. We recovered 4.3 billion pounds of food last year, and we know that we have the capacity to recover at least another billion pounds. But absolutely agree with what Nate's saying. I think part of the challenge that we've consistently had in this space is that these are complex challenges, and they will require nuanced answers. So there won't be one silver bullet that just cuts across everything. It's not as simple as 72 billion pounds going to landfill, 35 million people food insecure, put them together. But there is some magic in that. It's just that it doesn't solve for the whole problem, but it can be an important piece of an overall puzzle.
But it's one person at a time, right? I mean, I think that's, and if we can, I always feel like technology and platforms that are being developed should be able to move, just like Amazon can get me my groceries in 2 hours. Why couldn't somebody who's got excess food in a restaurant or excess groceries that have expired be able to get those to families? So,
and we have an app. We have an app for that, right? So we can. I think we're making some progress. That's part of the benefit from the silver lining from the pandemic, is we've had innovative partners who've come to the table and helped us with some of that technology, so we can do a better job of matching food that would otherwise go to waste with people who are struggling with food insecurity. So I think there is something to be said there too, ma'am.
Actually, this is a question for each of you. What are each of your organization's main priorities beyond the mission in the next 9 to 12 months? Anything that you're doing, is there anything that's like on the drawing board that you're excited about?
I'll jump in super quick. I think, there's an opportunity right now. We have a new administration, which opens the door for, I think, some, especially in the early days, for some new progress to be made that otherwise gets harder later on down the road. And I think comes at a time when there's a lot of focus and attention on the issues around food. So one of the things that World Central Kitchen is doing that perhaps a year ago we probably would not have thought we would be doing so much of is getting more hands-on and involved in looking at some of the policy and systemic issues that really the federal government needs to start to address, and be a voice there on those issues, even beyond the Feed Act, but really looking at all of these types of things and how food touches everything. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face overall in our country when we think about food is that too often food gets bucketed into agriculture. Right? Yeah. It lives in the USDA. The USDA makes a lot of decisions around food, but really food touches everything, right? Food is health. Food is for our aging populations as part of HHS. Food is, of course, labor and commerce. We think about all the amazing farm workers out in California. Food touches so many different places, and yet we don't really have a holistic approach to dealing with food. We have no Department of Food in this country, right? We have a Department of Agriculture. So I do think there is quite a bit of work that can be done there. So that's one area that's a bit new for us that we're really going big, because we think, over the course of the next 9 months, we have, some real potential. I know the amazing folks on this webinar with me right now, Billy and Claire, also their organizations are also really going hard and working with Congress and working with the new administration to push through some of these, really important topics. Especially, we've got child nutrition reauthorization coming up. We have a new farm bill coming up. So there's a lot of potential, I think, to use a bit of momentum here to bring about some real substantial change that will benefit everyone.
Yeah. Great. On our side, we have 4 areas that we are making transformational investments in. We need help in order to make those investments, but we believe that they are the key to transformational change. And it starts with what Nate just talked about and said so well. So yes, what Nate said. In addition to that, we're very focused on neighbor experience, and we're looking at how can we bring the dignity of choice to people facing hunger? How do we match technology with and innovation with the neighbor experience? How do we center people facing hunger in their experience? So that's definitely another area where we're making significant investments. Another area where we're making significant investments will be in that capacity infrastructure that I talked about before. This pandemic has been so revealing. All of the weakest links are just so obvious, and some of them broke during this pandemic. We're going back and we're building back some of these communities to ensure that there's more resiliency there with that infrastructure in every sense of that word, and certainly including having access to refrigeration and equipment that's necessary to be able to have nutritious food inside of the community and then share that food with the community. And then last but certainly not least is the work that we're doing in equity. Yeah. Here are some things that we know from the data, and we've got research scientists who work at Feeding America, and we also have access to other brilliant research scientists outside of our own organization. There are some things that we know to be true. Like, we know that people who live in certain parts of rural America are inordinately impacted by food insecurity. We know this to be true. We also know that no matter where people of color live, whether it's urban, suburban, rural, subrural, they are inordinately likely to be food insecure. We're planning to go deep in understanding why and in coming up with effective solutions. We started an equity fund and we seeded it with $20 million because we're serious about this. We're asking for other help in that work, and it's going to be community-based, BIPOC. We're going to be working with BIPOC-led organizations. We're going to have people with lived and living experience at the big table that we're creating with extra chairs. And those are the areas that we're serious about, and we're confident about our ability to have the impact that Billy was talking about before in this work. But you're going to have to go deep and you're going to have to go big in order to make it happen.
I know you're right out of time, Pam, so I'll make this quick. I think priorities are embedded in what we've already talked about. We've got to help our schools reopen in ways to be able to feed kids. America can't really go back to work if our kids can't go back to school. And so schools are coming online every day. That'll be probably our #1 priority. But the second will be to get to some of these systemic issues, particularly as it relates to child poverty. And we're exploring whether there's a value add that we can play in terms of helping families access this child tax credit that will be so important. And then to also think about the youngest kids, the kids, from birth to 5, who tend to get overlooked. There's not the same infrastructure that the school system provides for feeding them, but we've got to find some ways to do that, or we really risk a generation being kind of lost to some of the consequences of this pandemic. And at the end of the day, I think one of the things that we're all realizing as we're talking about food waste is this is a solvable problem. Not to say ending food waste solves it, but to say the magic that I think Claire was referring to is we have food in this country, we have food programs, and we have organizations like those on this call and many others that give us the ability to say this is of all the things that have come out of the pandemic, this is the piece that is the most solvable.
Yeah, no, Billy, I'm so impressed with your optimism, and having read about this is a problem that's solvable. Are there? Well, we are out of time. I could sit here and talk with all of you, each of you, and I did want to say, Nate, World Central Kitchen was on that top 20 list as well. And Billy, we are going to make sure that No Kid Hungry, Share Your Strength is on for next year. So let me just wrap up. Just a lightning response here is, what gives you optimism as you look to the future? Claire?
I get to see it all the time. I've been to 35 food banks in the middle of this pandemic. I can't even count how many food distributions I've been to. I get to see, feel, witness the impact of the remarkable generosity of the American public, including a lot of the people who are on this call. With this kind of energy and this kind of awareness, and then with other people like Billy and Nate who are invested in this work, there's no good reason why we can't solve hunger. I agree with Billy, and I believe we're going to get it done. I really do.
Nate.
For me, it's the response of the American people saying, hundreds of thousands of people who had not been involved before said, I want to make a difference on the issue of hunger. Many of them from Fidelity Charitable, but from all walks of life and all organizations. And it really, really inspired me that we're going to get this done.
I think one of the things that really gives me a lot of hope and optimism is seeing how the restaurants that we've been working with that really are such a fabric of our communities really found a new mission that they will continue. You know, talking to many of the restaurant owners and folks that have been serving, you know, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of meals to families in need, they're going to continue to find ways to serve. We're seeing this already. Work with an amazing restaurant in Oakland that has been able to raise some money directly itself to serve meals to the Asian American community that was impacted by the recent crises going on. They've set up a little, every day they go out to the market and get food for what they're going to cook. They set up a little wagon out front, and folks from the community can come by and take some food, like produce and things, for free from that little wagon. So we're seeing all of these ways that I think, you know, the restaurants are becoming part of the solution to helping feed our communities, and I'm excited because I do think that is going to continue, and those types of innovations, there's so many folks that can play a role, as both Billy and Claire just said, and that's going to be how we really address this, because there's not a shortage of food. It's just about getting food to those that really need it.
Good. Thank you so much. So, you know, obviously we covered a lot of information today, and as we wrap up, I encourage each of you who's been here to listen to be thinking and acting on some of the key takeaways that our panelists shared with us. I think first is keep giving. We didn't talk a lot about volunteerism, but I know how important that is to all of your organizations. We want to make sure that people are coming back to volunteer as they become able to do so. Seek opportunities to support infrastructure. Remember, that may mean refrigerators or new CRM tools or platforms of technology that allow us to really digitize the experience to make it easier for people to get food. And then I think third, use your voice. Consider becoming an advocate to fight for long-term hunger relief through policies that will address the root causes. We're sharing a Feeding America link in the chat box with information on how to effectively do that, since we had a number of people raise that question. So I want to thank you, Claire, Nate, and Billy, so much. Really appreciate the work you're doing. You give me so much optimism. And I'm, again, just thank you and grateful for you to be here. I want to thank again our Fidelity Charitable community for your ongoing generosity and commitment to make more of a difference. And as you sign off, we just ask for your feedback on how to continue to make these as engaging and enlightening conversations as we have here today. So thank you so much. Be well. Stay safe.
Thank you.